So as is the tradition here at SCAR, we'll bring our outside professor in to ask questions first. So Jerry Merritt, please.
Great. Again, my apologies for being late. It's inexcusable. But you have a very strong dissertation, and I'd like to say it's impressive also that you're building on prior research of your own, which deepens the groove that you've been digging. And it's normal in these things to preface with positive and then go for the jugular. But I do want to start with a sincere praise of what's good about this. It is an impressive work, it's an important work. But there's a couple large points that... Okay, first point. Is it possible that the entire work underestimates the power of the media? Because let's take what's going on in the West Bank now. The media gets to decide where the coverage begins. There's an ongoing chain of events between Jewish settlers and Palestinians. So the media might not cover the Palestinian rock throwing that led to the Jewish settlers to beat up an old woman, which led to the arrest of a settler, which his conviction led to payback or the price taking that the Jewish. So the media gets to decide which is the first item. What is what you call, the context. The context, or no, the trigger event. How can you address that media power?
I think you're right, and I don't think that this accounts for that. I think an analysis that would really need to be more contextual or more actual of the different themes that are being presented when they start the story, those kinds of things. I think would need to be done to account for that kind of power, because I don't think that this can get there. I think. This doesn't show whether the context was something that was useful to the terrorist group or not. I mean, it's just saying that there was contextual information presented. It's not saying, was this contextual information useful for them or not. So I don't think it gets there. I think there's a lot in the narrative components and the actual storytelling and what stories are being told that I'm not accounting for, that are useful and very powerful. I also think that the media does have a large role in terms of the quantity argument. That that if by doing something, if they can initiate media coverage, they're getting publicity for themselves. So I was trying to get away from that kind of the quantity argument to try to do something about the quality. But I think that quantity argument has a lot of weight, and that this is maybe an additional piece on it. But that quantity argument, as well as more of what are the stories being told, has a lot of weight as well.
And when we talked about this, I think many months ago, I told you about the Australian journalist who talked about one Australian life is X, and that's 5 Americans and 10 Frenchmen. And so the Australian news coverage of foreign news is determined by nearness and death. And I would think if there is a next step to this, if you were going to pursue a further deepening, it may be time to go all qualitative, and go to journalists and say, you were the person covering West Bank this month. Why did you start here? Did you go to your editor and say, let's do this, and they didn't want to cover that one, but once somebody died, they said yes, and to get into the media's power that way. Okay, media target. You assume that terrorist groups are aiming at the media, and I would think we'd want to make that more complex, i.e. some groups are going to be targeting media and some aren't. And I'm going to ask you, who is the target of Hamas? What is their goal when they send a suicide bomber into Tel Aviv?
I think they have a couple different audiences. So I think there is a local goal of maintaining fear and instability, which may or may not actually need that much media coverage because there'd be word of mouth in the local area. But I think what they're looking for is they don't actually. Their goal isn't actually the media coverage. The goal is to impact people, and they're using the media as a mechanism to get there. So they have a relatively local audience. They want to, impact the perception of Israelis that this is a conflict that's still worth fighting. They potentially want to impact the Israeli government. with either forcing them to overreact, which they often do, and perpetuate the cycle. But then I also think they're using media to get to a much broader audience. So this is why in the choice of the newspaper outlets, I was using one that was local to the conflict and one that was in a broader audience. Because they're looking to get messages to their outside supporters as well. So they're looking to get messages to people who are going to donate money to their cause. They're looking to get messages to potential recruits, and they're looking to get messages for allies that I think that are outside that conflict zone.
Who are these potential recruits?
Well, I think it could be someone who reads this, if they can send the message about grievance and that they're so abused in this way, can we get folks to come and be allies or be on our side, participate?
Are you familiar with, it's American politics, but Salisbury has done this thing about interest groups in the American context, and the real enemy of the Audubon Society is Greenpeace. Because if they portray themselves as more radical and more active, then they lose funding and they lose followers. So is Hamas most concerned at an operational level with killing Jews in order that young Palestinians who are angry know that Hamas gets things done, i.e. we kill Jews, we're Hamas. And they're worried about the right challenge, the right-wing challenge of Islamic Jihad, saying, no, we kill more Jews and we don't worry about any peace process ever. And they're worried about the PLO, and they were going to portray the PLO the way the Greenpeace portrays the Audubon Society. So is the media really that relevant to Hamas decision-making? Since, you know, the Palestinian populace of the Gaza is going to find out that Jews were killed, as you say, by word of mouth.
I think when I was doing my master's research, one of the things that I was looking at was what are the different goals that terrorist groups are trying to do, and one of the categories that I actually came up with was this whole set of organizational goals, which really don't have anything to do with their long-term goal of a Palestinian state. It doesn't really have anything to do with Al Qaeda's long-term goal of overthrow of the West. These really are very concrete goals. So these are about getting messages of getting a message that we are powerful, we're worth joining, we have strength as an organization, we're relevant because we're in the media, we're in the news, and then I do think the media plays a role in those goals. I think the media plays a role in legitimizing an organization as powerful enough that you should be willing to support it if you're a potential ally. So you're a potential donor, and one group has a whole bunch of media coverage about them, and the other one, another organization isn't being covered at all. And I think this is much the same as in political parties, right? I mean, if one political party is actually achieving getting their voice heard and another one isn't, and they both seem to share your values, which one are you more likely to support? So I do think that there is a strong role, both in recruitment, and I'm not sure that that's as much for Hamas, because I think they do have their local pool, but if you look at other organizations more broad, like Al Qaeda and others, who I think are very much using media messages, not necessarily mass media, but media messages for recruitment purposes, I do think that there's that level that really doesn't have anything to do with the idealism, but is about how do I as an organization get the money and the people I need, and get the general support, at least the tacit support of some group outside myself.
Great. Well, I have one very small question and one other. The very small one is, I think you're in danger of over-interpreting small number differences. When you were talking about the effects there, when your N was 16 and your N was 32, and you were saying here it went from 54 and there it went to 71. If your 16 sample pool had one more negative story, then the effect almost vanishes. It's cut in half, the comparative effect. So I would caution you, and we've talked about this, the small N over-interpretation is going to be a barrier to publication of this further. I think you're on that borderline with some of your observations where I pushed you really hard to say something, pull out, and now I'm coming in and saying, be careful not to say too much. And that's just the way professors are.
And I agree. I think, I wish that towards the end I realized I wish I'd done some things very differently at the beginning in terms of setting up the sample, in terms of the numbers, because one of the things that happened was that as the coders were going through, one of the first questions they were asking was, is this article relevant to this topic? So what we found was a whole bunch of articles that might have a keyword of terrorism, but they're a political speech in which a leader is listing the 7 things that he wants to take care of. And we just pulled those out of the pool because they weren't really about what we were doing. Or
which I think was a wise choice. I'm not
Yeah.
saying there was a way to get a bigger end that wouldn't have involved
Right.
more abusive undergrads. Last question. It might be helpful to divide terrorist conflicts between those that have a greater or lesser, and you could even do a number of foreign interest. Because I think of the Tamil independence movement in Sri Lanka. There was a little bit of funding from India, from Tamils there, but it wasn't even close to the IRA conflict
Absolutely.
or PLO and Hamas in terms of the level of external support and funding and concern. So this process, if it works the way you identified it, it may work very, very differently for terrorism conflicts that are intrinsically local. And then beyond that, there's usually one actor that would like to make it more international. That's usually the terror group, or those, as you would say, choosing the terror tactic. But you have a very complex model already with lots of flow and media. But I think adding that component of whether the target might be foreign media, foreign audiences, more or less.
I agree. I think there's some organizations for whom media really isn't all that important, and I think that's in the literature as well. With what some other folks have looked at, is to say that there really are some that are focused on media, and media really does something for them, and then there's some that media is just happening and they don't really care. It's not really part of their decision structure. So I think IRA and Hamas are media focused because they have these external tendencies. You're right, the LTTE, they had India and then a diaspora in Canada, and that's about the only people that cared about what was going on there. So though they had a really pretty complex media strategy, if you look at what their website was, and they had a whole series of holidays and events and speeches that they would record, and they were actually very good at presenting this with a completely different narrative than the Sri Lankan government would do, and were very complex on the web before. They presented themselves as a very legitimate organization through web, even if they weren't getting mainstream media coverage. It's one that I have my undergrads go check out terrorist group websites when I teach on terrorism, so that's one that they have enjoyed.
Thank you very much. Dan, please.
Okay.
Well, I really first want to commend you for doing some very important work, combining qualitative and quantitative methods. Not only the centrality of the topic, but the depth of the analysis was really quite commendable. And we could see that throughout at various chapters. And so one of the characteristics of good work is it raises many questions. So I had some questions, so I just want to ask a couple questions. In your first model, you had a very nice overview of actions and response, media responses, audience responses, behavioral responses. And I was wondering, I think resonating with one of your questions, about the complexity of audience, who are the audience, of course it differs for different groups. And then in many cases, of course, the difference between audience response and behavioral policy, that kind of collapses. So how, can you talk about nuancing that? How does that, I mean, it's not clearly, not all groups have the same audience in mind.
Well, and they often have multiple audiences in mind. I mean, you often have a local audience, and then potentially a regional audience, and then potentially a more international audience.
Right.
So I think that there is, particularly if you're talking about audience response and behavioral response, the context then of that really matters. So if you are in if you're in the United States in the 1990s when the IRA are kind of this romantic figures fighting for freedom, then your response to a media article may be very different than if you're in London in the 1990s and the IRA does something. So I absolutely think that where the context matters and the previous belief structures and how this fits with the story you tell. The other thing that I think is worth noting is that not all of those things may actually impact the next thing the way you think it would. So that while a terrorist group or a media coverage may think that they're going to get a certain kind of audience response, They may not. I mean, there's no guarantee of what if the calculation is going to roll in that direction. So I think it's a and that model came from me just trying to sit down and figure out where to put the literature together. Like, how do all the different people that are writing about media coverage and framing it, where do they fit into the process, if we have a process? But I don't think it's, I think there's a lot of soft spots in there. I mean, I think there's a lot of places that are really dependent on particular circumstances, and they're not something that you can say, oh, when a terrorist group does this, we're going to get this policy response at the end, because there's lots of different variations that could happen between here and there.
Well, and your perspective is kind of like a little bit, it's certainly above the fray, obviously, and above the analytical fray. And so it would be interesting to see in your strategic framing, you know, big pictures is all strategic. Is that what they had in mind? You know,
Right.
I mean, in a way, and a lot of social scientists do this. It's kind of like the underlying, quote, rationality of what they're doing. I mean, is that the kind of thing that they had in mind? In other words, is there a way to show that, in fact, oh yeah, they really did monitor these things in this way, which is kind of a parallel framing, getting at, as it were, the grounding of their communications, obviously.
I agree. I mean, I think they're really looking at the second order of, I mean, they really want the audience response and the policy response, and they're going through the media to get there. The media aren't the end run. And I think it would be, I mean, I think there's another loop in there to say, if the audience responds in this way to a particular event, it might impact the decision making about what you're going to do. So, you know, the best example for this being Al-Qaeda in Iraq, who ended up losing substantial support from the general population because some of their attacks started focusing on Muslims, because they started having more kind of diverse, you know, marketplace attacks. And at least the tacit support, if not the active support of a lot of Iraqis, they lost it. So, you know, their audience response out here, you know, they obviously had miscalculated what their audience response was going to be, but it was obviously really important for them to then get into their decision making that, hey, oh wait, you know, that isn't, we need to pay attention to that. So I think there's a sequence of different, you know, loops and that could be in there that may be as important, if not more important, than the loop back between the media and the terrorist group. But I can only get one.
Right, exactly. I really appreciate and found valuable your use of the multiple thematic frames, and which, by the way, if I may just suggest, a frame is you know, it's obviously a very complicated kind of, I mean, it's not only a conceptual tool, but it's also the imaging, obviously, which is what you started with today, the icons. So the framing obviously has different cognitive units to it. But did you have, I was wondering in reading your dissertation, was there a way of establishing a stronger correlation between some frames as opposed to other? Now, I know you said there were 4 that you identified.
Five.
There were 5
Right.
that you began with, and then did you find stronger correlation in the dependent as a result of that?
There wasn't as much. There actually wasn't as much change in those actual content frames as I thought there might be. It seemed like terrorism was being covered pretty consistently, with 80% was in content or had a conflict frame to it. Another 20 to 30% had a human interest frame, and that seemed to be pretty consistent no matter what the independent variables were, which was a little surprising. You would think that violence would bring out the human interest frame, much more strongly. And there was a few of those variations, but I ended up after the first sample not continuing to use that sequence of 5 frames because it didn't seem like there was enough variation there to continue using that variable, in the next analysis. So. I was a little surprised that there was more consistency in those frames across the different articles.
Okay. And one last question that I can appreciate the difficulty of using the kind of duality of favorable, unfavorable, because this, I mean, it's a very it's compelling, obviously, methodologically, but I can imagine you think, well, it depends how you're reading the story. And you have to put in your mind, anticipating or imagining how different audiences are reading the story. And then, of course, there's subterranean messages, which is one of the main points of main themes of your work. So, so that seems like I don't know. I don't have a solution here.
Well, and I think that I think the design misses that, and I think that the attempt, and a lot of what I've done before was much more kind of narrative, really engrossed in the actual article and all the different component parts. And what I was trying to do was find a structure that was a little less, find a structure to quantitatively look at some of these qualitative differences. But by doing that, by making these in or out, on the coding instructions, it was either a yes or a no. It wasn't a maybe, or a, all right, no, that's a 2 on a scale of 10. It was either it's present or not. I think I do miss a lot of what could be more detailed. What is this context? How is this context going to impact someone? And I think that the design does that. I'm not sure there was a way, and so other research that you actually were on my thesis committee. When I did the master's thesis, I did get a little bit, more into that detail. But I think I was trying to do something a little bit different here to be able to tell a story.
Well, it could be done. It's just that's your next work. After this gets published.
And then you don't have to read that one. You'll be responsible for that
I
one.
want to read it. I think, whatever, continuation. Great contributions. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
All right, great. Well, I've had an opportunity to ask many questions over the course of this, so I'll keep mine focused to some big picture issues. What stood out most to me, and picks up on something Dan said about the idea of favorable coverage. And what's fascinating about this thesis is that it's an investigation. I won't call it a how-to manual, but in a sense, it's an investigation of how it is that the terrorists get favorable coverage for their causes. And it's intriguing to think about what the favorable cause or coverage might be. In a way, I feel like you're excavating a rhetorical unconscious of the journalistic profession. You're sort of discovering things where you don't know you're doing this, you smart journalists who've been doing this for 20 years, but in fact, you are in fact empowering the terrorists doing this, or you're not doing it in other ways. I'm wondering, among those that stand out to you, which are of the various thematic divisions that you have, which is the most compelling success indicator of them, and how would you clue us into paying attention as both as consumers and also as investigators of media to being aware of those kind of rhetorical conventions?
I think the one that, I think the one that I am most struck by is the sequence argument. Part of why I'm so struck by it is that it's based on so much other research that shows how strongly the sequence is correlated to whether this is considered deviant violence, ambiguous violence, or normal violence. And I think what's really interesting for me in terrorism is how varied that is. That a lot of the conventions that are there for hate crimes, for murders, for other kinds of things don't hold when you talk about terrorism violence. And so I think it is a place where I think some of this unconscious is a little unsettled. They're not quite as sure what their pattern is. And I think that watching changes in that over the life of a conflict, for instance, might actually really tell us something about what's happening in the conflict. So, journalists are reporting in ways that they're understanding their communities will understand. So they are reflecting to some degree the social understanding that exists already at the same time as they're creating it. And so I think that sequence as a one moment could really follow and change over the life of a conflict as a group is understood as more or less legitimate.
More than the thematic versus episodic framing?
I think so.
Okay.
I think so. Mainly because I think it's not as clear to me that thematic framing is always favorable to a terrorist group. You can imagine a thematic frame that goes into long detail about the victim's past and history and where they come from. So I'm less convinced that that's always a positive than I am with the sequencing.
Okay, good. And then this feeds into another point, which is to put on my Aristotle hat for a minute and say that I think this is not sort of just pure science, but also as a kind of an intervention into the world. And thinking about not just the conflict analysis piece, which is obviously is, but the conflict resolution piece. So what's the lesson for conflict resolution, for intervention in the world of dealing with terrorism and so on for the work? I'm struck by the finding you have of the and it's interesting to see how confident you are in it about violence without casualties or with minimal casualties is an effective way to get your grievance or your coverage out there. But also, in a sense, it suggests that perhaps nonviolent dramatic action would be another way you could do it. So you could imagine inserting that into the toolkit of some of these organizations, and you'd have evidence to suggest, in fact, imagining that that you're ever sitting down with such actors that they might want to even think about that. Is that a kind of resolution implication? Also, what about on the journalistic side? If there is this kind of rhetorical unconscious, this journalistic unconscious, is there a way to use the work to help journalists to to craft their stories in more responsible ways? And how do you deal with the line between objectivity and activism, between opinion journalism and just coverage and so on, that seems to bedevil this area of peace journalism?
So with the organizations, I think one of the things that is true of actors that do not have access to the political conversation is that often they don't have the tools to get access to the political conversation. So I think and essentially what's happening is the violent groups are hijacking the message of often much broader nonviolent communities, or hijacking the grievances and claiming to represent these much broader communities. But it's because they have the easy tool of using violence, and that gets people's attention. You don't have to have a really savvy media strategy if you're going to use violence. So I think there is a potential for intervening with groups that may share the same identity group but are choosing to be nonviolent in looking with them or training with them or thinking with them about how do you improve your media strategy. What are the kinds of things you could do? What celebrities do you need to get involved in your cause to get attention on you? How many, what kinds of marches or events or other kinds of things? I think going back to some of the criteria of newsworthiness, how do we help them figure out how to get their message out there more often, and thereby kind of deflate the power of the violent groups, because they're no longer the only actor in the public discourse who's speaking on behalf of this particular population. I think the other component, though, is to think about how are we incentivizing or disincentivizing the violent groups, and I think that's with the journalists, and I think it's been more clearly potentially recently with the mass violence incidents, the mass school shootings, other kinds of things, is that some of those folks are doing this to get their 15 minutes of fame. I mean, they may be suicidal, they may want to go out anyway on their own, but whoa, look at this. Over the last 5 years, if you go up and shoot up a school, everybody knows your name. I mean, I don't know the names of any of the Columbine victims, but I know the names of the 2 perpetrators of Columbine, and I think probably most of America does. So I think there's something to be said for, we don't want to impose censorship with journalists, but could we do training with them? Could we have a conversation with them about, so if you need to cover this event, it's a big event, it's a big splashy event, what are the ways in which you could cover this differently that is going to provide less incentive for the next person to do it? So after the Boston bombings, and there was a point there for a day or two where maybe we needed to know those guys' names so that they could be tracked down and caught. But why are we continuing to focus on them? And I think there's been some pushback, and particularly after the Boston bombing, coming out of social media from the public saying, we'd like you to stop. We'd like you to stop martyrizing, we'd like you to stop we'd like you to stop promoting the self-aggrandizing objectives of these people. And I think that's a place where I don't think journalists know this is what they're doing. And Karen Cerullo actually had gone in, and part of her work was she interviewed journalists, and she said, how do you go about constructing your story? And they said to her, well, every time it's just a little bit different. Every time it's based on, what happened in the circumstances. And then she comes out and shows that, no, it's not actually a little bit different every time. There's some really consistent patterns. So I think there's a part of saying, I'm not sure y'all realize that this is what you're doing, but here's what you're doing. Here's the incentives it provides, and here's how you can cover that event in a different way. And I think it is tricky. I mean, it is tricky to figure out, how is this not censorship? How is this not undermining free press, but rather is them potentially having some data, some information on what they may be doing that they could be contributing to some of these social concerns.
That's great. So there's a possibility for an impartial peace journalism, you say, which was just activism per se, but is. I
think so, and I think the journalists now can do it. I mean, I don't think you need to have a different. But I just don't think that they're necessarily aware of the extent that their patterns may be impacting people's actions.
Thank you. Well, audience members who would like to ask a question?
Uh-oh.
Management.
She said questions.
course.
I did. Are you facilitating this?
No,
Am I
you
facilitating
go.
this?
You go.
All right, Andrea, you got your hand up first.
So thank you for the presentation. I learned a lot. I'm very intrigued by this lethality threshold. And the reason I'm intrigued is because the background that I was listening to through was ETA. Very wise use of non-lethal violence. ETA would call people to say, we're putting a bomb over there, making sure that you have a lot of, and then some other time being very lethal. I'm killing you, I'm killing this person. Very different strategies. But ETA moves away from violence, very interestingly, because of media coverage. So I really have the invitation for you to continue your research. And maybe there may be something there that could be interesting. Because at least some theory goes in the direction of saying that after 9/11, violence becomes not palatable media-wise. That ETA cannot hold the capacity for a violence that is in a way meaningful, but politically relevant. So, two observations. One, violence that is not lethal is almost non-violent. Is a spectacle, is an interruption, is a little bit of a tantrum, but it's not really violent. So there is a threshold that you could study and it could be very interesting, because what I heard today is this fascinating description of people that have clearly no sympathy for a terrorist group necessarily, but end up giving them credit and favorable coverage, even though they are not Patriot Act supporters.
Right.
And I really hope that there will be nobody here listening you doing the other step of, in a way, getting all these people who are giving favorable coverage to terrorists doing non-lethal action, because you could go also in that direction.
Right.
Say, why are you so favorable covering this? Because maybe there is something there about this question that you shared at the beginning, that it's very difficult to have an identity terrorist that is not self-actualized. So the terrorists are actually trying to do something else. They're not trying to terrorize, they're
Right.
trying to exist. And I really like your frame of saying a lot of these actions are actually meant to recruit, to exist, to send a message, I exist, I count, I am relevant in this environment. But I was curious, what was your reaction to this idea of what I call, that listening to you, or this lethality threshold? Because I feel that is actually quite interesting, very, very interesting.
Well, I think the other part of it is to what extent is non-lethality by a terrorist group unexpected? So, I think one of the things that happened with ETA was the Madrid train bombing, and everybody's initial response that ETA had somehow done the Madrid train bombing, and anybody who'd done any study of ETA at all said, no, they didn't. There's no way they would have done that. It's completely out of character, it's anti what they do. But there was a lot of media attention right on that right away, because it was so surprising for them. It wasn't their typical kind of pinpoint attack. And so I think it'd be interesting to think about groups that initially use violence to get into the political conversation, but then continue to be in the political conversation, and they don't have to continue to be violent. So, ETA reached a threshold, through the 80s and early 90s, where they had made themselves fairly relevant in the political conversation, but they didn't have to then potentially continue being violent because they already been legitimized. So I think there could be something interesting there, and I think this goes to this audience reaction, the second order effect, that it wasn't actually the media coverage that delegitimized violence for ETA, it was the people reading the media coverage who said, wait a minute, this isn't acceptable anymore. Based on 9/11, our context has changed, and we're just really not interested. I think, both, it'd be interesting one of the things I think would be interesting is to get into that black box by actually having conversations with people who are in those kinds of decision-making positions within organizations that are trying to get into the conversation. And I'm not aware of anybody really successfully on other than a really idiosyncratic basis being able to get into that black box. So we're looking at what's coming out of the black box and making assumptions about what's going on in there, but we can't get in there yet.
maybe on the ETA case we can get some connection.
Yeah.
One thing, the final point on this issue of the peace journalism. There is a collateral effect that you clearly do not mention here, but actually has to do with covering any lethal, deadly incident. That is clearly Iraq body count, and the fact that media allows for an understanding of violence and its effect in a way that nobody else does, exactly by the accumulating knowledge that is generated by covering one after the other, after the other, after the other. So I think that that's a very interesting new world in which we are, which is clearly very different from your kind of research, but I would strongly encourage people interested in media and conflict resolution to see this as part of it, because I think it's an important recognition of the victim imperative and all that. One caution on your jumping into mass violence and the killing and the final observation that you were making, but I think that there is a qualitative difference between an individual trying to have fame and a political statement. And I do think that there is almost a reverse role, and that's just a little bit of
Yeah. No, I don't think you can take this and roll it onto mass violence just whole hog. But I do think that there is, where the connection for me is in incentive structures. That media, by its nature and by what it's doing, is setting up incentive structures for certain kinds of behavior, and that's happening both for terrorism and for mass violence. Is that this coverage is incentivizing certain behavior, and I don't think it's the behavior we actually would like it to incentivize, or we need to disincentivize some of that behavior.
Thank you. Couldn't have picked a more timely comment. I'm sitting here still, but I'm bouncing on the inside. Two things. One was in the early in the slides, you used the word manipulation a lot. Manipulation of the media. And I was curious about why you didn't use the media, or just make use of the media, like companies do, like politicians do. Why in your mind was this more of a manipulation?
Sure.
Which ties into my second question is just, so I happen to know a couple of these journalists, these Wall Street Journal, New York Times guys. They're pretty smart, they read Hannah Arendt, they're pretty wise. I don't see them, my hallucination is that they're not being manipulated. They think they're savvy, but I don't know. I mean, I believe that they have patterns that they're not aware of, right? That they don't see, that you're Karen, something mentioned, saw. So now I'm actually going to speak. I'm going to ask him when I see him a little bit about that. So I guess they're connected in that sense of media knows that they're a vehicle. Journalists know that they're being pulled and used. It's been happening their whole lives. Why manipulation and why?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, some of that I think just reflects the extent to which I feel like it's malignant, right? That, a publicity for a company that wants publicity for something doesn't necessarily strike me as quite as malignant. So I think there's part of that, so I'm putting a negative frame on it just because of what it is. But I do think there's another component that I also think it's much less overt, right? I mean, so somebody who hires a public relations expert to use the media to get out the message about their products is being pretty overt about the fact that they're trying to use the media. This, to me, is less, it's less overt, right? I mean, these things are being framed as we're doing this as part of our ideology, but wait a minute, we're kind of paying attention to what the media is going to do with it over here. So that may be part of why I'm kind of in that manipulation zone, that this isn't something that they would admit to if they were asked, or potentially not. But it also may just be that I'm responding with a negative word because of the negative context.
I wanted to pick up on this point that Andrea, putting this in a historical context, and looking at the guerrilla movements of the 70s, let's say in Latin America or in Iran where I grew up. It was all about propaganda, because the guerrillas knew that they're not going to be able to defeat the army by these little acts. It was how it reflected. And the way they calculated their moves was so different than this kind of blind mass violence. It was always a military target. It was always, even sometimes when they were killing a general, they were careful not to kill the driver. and this all reflected in the media. As growing up in Iran in the 70s, I used to be riveted. I used to, 13, 14 years, I was the audience. I can see, and it was not just that they calculated, they had their sympathizers in the media. So people who were writing about them and talking about how they are terrorists, they would also glorify them about saying how they bought the guy's motorcycle when they were running away. So it was a fascinating, when you look at the inside, and then films like State of Siege, which was very promotional of this act. And so maybe this is not the same kind of political violence, but it'd be interesting to see how it reflects in those.
It was intentional about choosing two groups that are ethnic separatists with a little bit of religion thrown in there in terms of these two cases, because I think there are pretty substantial differences when you look at the spectrum of terrorist organizations. And B.J. Cunningham, in something that we put out here on terrorism, had a really nice typology, because it really does matter. An ethnic separatist group has to be very careful to make sure that they don't offend their own ethnic allies. So they need to be very careful about who their targets are, how they're targeting them, and for the most part, they need to be seen as rational and with a capacity to replace the government in charge, right? If they were able to get there, so they need that level of support. So going out and committing mass violence attacks in the middle of a marketplace where you're potentially killing your own members of your own, ethnic group or religious group or whatever, isn't a good plan. But if you are a religious fundamentalist group whose interest is in essentially wiping out populations of the other, then it would make sense for you to go do mass violence accounts. So I think there is a lot in thinking, and I think we have to be really careful when we're talking about terrorist groups that we think about what kind of group it is, because their actions are going to differ based on what their goals are and what their ideology is, and what our response needs to be to them will differ based on kind of what kind of group they are and how they're moving. So this is lumps kind of all of it together, but I do think that there's some distinct differences, and you are more likely with a group that's an ethnic separatist group or something like that to have collaborators, potentially in the media or in other places that share that ethnicity or share some other connection. Yeah, Rich.
Just to piggyback on that, it's another example of the relativity of some of your conclusions, your correlations. I think also what Andrea said about violent acts that don't kill people are in some ways not violent. The Weathermen didn't kill anybody except one flight accident, and two of their own people. The Weather Underground only blew up offices.
Right.
That, as I recall, did not produce a lot of favorable publicity for the weather people. In fact, the tendency on the part of the media was to say that's the same violence as the violence that kills people. That was the distinction that the media were not interested in making at all at that point. And so context is everything.
Yeah. And I think depending on which country you're in, that might be very different, and what because there's also how the government gets a chance to frame this, right? I mean, the government gets some opportunity to frame folks as into what level of legitimacy their violent action is. So, I mean, I think the Weather Underground was really not understood to be very legitimate, by a lot of folks. So they weren't going to be willing to give them a break on this to say, well, no, actually, this isn't as bad as if you were killing someone. But I agree. I think context. Because the context of how we're going to read it is going to inform the media of how they're supposed to report it.
Yes, you might say just that the extent of mass support is a crucial variable.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're in Italy and you're the Red Brigades are kneecapping judges,
Right.
then a lot of people in Italy are saying, well, they just kneecapped them.
Right.
They didn't kill them.
Right.
Right? That's not the kind of result you can get in a society where there basically is zero mass support for the
Right. Well, and the Red Brigades are interesting in Italy because there is actually some evidence that they timed their events for Mondays and Wednesdays, I think, because the Tuesday and Thursday newspaper editions were much bigger. and had more copy space to cover the events that they did. So they actually had themselves onto a media cycle where they knew when the editors went to print, and they knew what the best times of day were and the best days of the week and all of this to get themselves covered, and were relatively successful and savvy with it.
Any other questions? No? All right. Well, I invite the committee to come.